Tonight the world grows quiet, the fire burns low, and somewhere beyond the edge of sleep, a mind begins to wander. 5 centuries ago, under the soft glow of candlelight, ink dried slowly on parchment filled with strange reversed letters. In shadowed workshops, wooden wings rested against stone walls. In silent rooms, careful hands traced the hidden architecture of the human body. In the hills of Tuscany, in the courts of Milan, in distant chambers where ideas felt larger than the walls that contained them, there lived a man who seemed to observe everything, not simply to see it, but to understand it. He studied the curve of water as it moved around stone. He followed the mathematics hidden inside beauty. He watched the sky, not as a dreamer but as a questioner. Tonight, we gently step into that watching mind. If you find yourself enjoying these quiet journeys through history, you're always welcome to subscribe. It truly helps this channel continue creating these long, unhurried stories. And if sleep finds you along the way, let it come. There is nothing you need to remember. The story will carry you. Now, let us drift back to 15th century Italy, where, in the Tuscan countryside, a child was born into a world that had no idea how far his curiosity would reach. On April 15th, in the third hour of the night, in the small town of Vinci or perhaps in the nearby hamlet of Anciano, a child came into the world under circumstances that might have, in another life, consigned him to obscurity. His mother was Caterina, a young woman of the lower class, possibly from a peasant background, perhaps even of Middle Eastern origin as some scholars suggest. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a 25-year-old notary from a respected family, a man whose profession required education, connections, and a certain social standing. They were not married. They would never marry. The child born that April night was illegitimate, and in the complex social hierarchy of 15th century Italy, this single fact would shape everything that followed. The infant was named Leonardo, but he had no surname in the way we understand the term today. Da Vinci simply meant from Vinci, a geographical designation, not a family name. His full birth name, Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci, meant Leonardo, son of Ser Piero from Vinci. That Ser before his father's name indicated that Piero was a gentleman, a notary, someone with status. But the shadow of illegitimacy hung over the child nonetheless. We know remarkably little about Leonardo's first years, and what we do know comes filtered through later accounts, colored by legend and speculation. The traditional story holds that he was born in Anciano, a tiny hamlet that would have offered the privacy appropriate for an illegitimate birth, away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of the town proper. It is still possible, however, that he was born in a house in Florence that Ser Piero almost certainly owned. Both parents married other people within a year of Leonardo's birth, Ser Piero to a 16-year-old girl named Albiera, and Caterina to a local man. Young Leonardo would not grow up in either of these new households as a fully integrated family member. For the first 3 to 5 years of his life, Leonardo likely lived with his mother, either in Anciano or in another hamlet called Campo Zeppi in the parish of San Pantaleone. Here, in the Tuscan countryside far from the intellectual ferment of the cities, the young boy's eyes would have opened to a world of natural wonders. The landscape around Vinci was, and remains, breathtaking in its variety and its beauty. Rolling hills covered with vineyards and olive groves, punctuated by stands of cypress and pine. Rocky outcrops where the bones of the earth pushed through the soil. Streams that carved channels through limestone, creating caves and grottos where water dripped and echoed in darkness. Birds of every description, hawks and kites wheeling in the thermals above the hills, songbirds hidden in the hedgerows, waterfowl in the marshes along the Arno River valley below. It was in this landscape, historians believe, that Leonardo developed the extraordinary powers of observation that would characterize his entire life. While other children played at warfare or merchant stalls, Leonardo watched. He watched how water moved, how it caught the light, how it carved stone over time. He watched how birds adjusted their wings to catch the wind, how they spiraled upward or dove with folded wings. He watched how light filtered through leaves, how shadows fell at different times of day, how the color of distant hills changed as moisture in the air scattered the light. This was not idle watching, not mere daydreaming. Even as a child, Leonardo was beginning to train himself in what would become his greatest skill, the ability to observe the world with relentless, systematic, penetrating attention to detail. By the time Leonardo was 3 years old, Ser Piero had taken custody of him, and the boy moved into his paternal grandfather's household in Vinci proper. Tax records from 1457 show Leonardo living with his grandfather Antonio da Vinci, his uncle Francesco, and presumably his father when Ser Piero was in town, which was not often. Ser Piero was establishing himself in Florence, building a successful career as a notary, handling legal documents and property transactions for the city's wealthy merchant class. He had already begun producing a large family with his young wife Albiera. Leonardo would eventually have 12 half-siblings from his father's various marriages, though he was the only child Ser Piero and Caterina had together. The household in Vinci seems to have been relatively comfortable. The family owned land, had some standing in the community. Leonardo's uncle Francesco, only 16 years older than Leonardo himself, appears to have been particularly close to the boy. There are hints in later records that Francesco and Leonardo spent time together in the countryside, exploring, observing, perhaps discussing what they saw. Francesco would later become one of Leonardo's heirs, suggesting that the bond formed in childhood endured throughout Leonardo's life. But if the household was comfortable, Leonardo's education was anything but formal. As an illegitimate child, doors were closed to him. He could not attend university. He could not follow his father into the notary profession, which required a legitimate birth certificate and admission to the appropriate guild. The professions that required learning Latin, the language of education and scholarship, were effectively closed to him. Instead, Leonardo received what contemporary sources describe as a basic and informal education in vernacular Italian, reading, writing, and arithmetic, taught perhaps by a local priest or a tutor hired by his father, but nothing more. In retrospect, this apparent disadvantage may have been one of Leonardo's greatest strokes of fortune. Because he did not receive a traditional university education, he was not indoctrinated into the scholastic philosophy that dominated European thought in the 15th century. Scholasticism relied heavily on received wisdom, on the authority of ancient texts, on Aristotelian logic and Platonic forms. It was a system that valued textual authority over direct observation, that sought truth in books rather than in nature. Leonardo, denied access to this system, was forced to educate himself by the very method that would make him great. By looking at the world itself, by trusting his own eyes, by conducting his own experiments, by drawing his own conclusions. Years later, as a mature artist and scientist, Leonardo would write with something like pride about his lack of formal education. He called himself an unlettered man, and he argued that direct experience was a better teacher than any book. Though I may not, like them, be able to quote other authors, he wrote, I shall rely on that which is much greater and more worthy, on experience, the mistress of their masters. This was revolutionary thinking in an age when authority came from ancient texts, not from observation and experiment. But for Leonardo, growing up outside the system, it was simply natural. In Vinci, Leonardo's artistic talent became apparent early. Ser Piero, despite his frequent absences, clearly paid some attention to his illegitimate son's development. The 16th century biographer Giorgio Vasari, whose account must be taken with a grain of salt given his tendency toward dramatic embellishment, tells a story of Leonardo as a young boy creating a terrifying image of a monster on a wooden shield for a local peasant. The creature Leonardo painted was so realistic, so frightening in its detail, Vasari describes it as a composite of lizards, crickets, serpents, butterflies, and bats, that Ser Piero, upon seeing it, recoiled in shock. Recognizing its value, he sold Leonardo's painting to a Florentine art dealer for 100 ducats, bought a cheap replacement shield for the peasant, and pocketed the profit. Whether this story is true or not, it captures something essential about Leonardo even in boyhood, an ability to observe nature in minute detail and recreate it with startling verisimilitude, and perhaps a certain macabre fascination with the grotesque and the hybrid. By the time Leonardo was around 12 years old, Ser Piero's first wife Albiera died. This personal tragedy seems to have prompted Ser Piero to take more interest in his eldest son. The notary moved Leonardo to Florence, closer to his own place of business, and began showing the boy's drawings to professional artists in the city. One of these artists was Andrea del Verrocchio, who ran one of the most prestigious workshops in Florence. Verrocchio looked at Leonardo's drawings. We can imagine them, perhaps studies of faces, of drapery, of plants and animals observed in the Vinci countryside, and agreed to take the boy as an apprentice. In 1466, when Leonardo was 14 years old, he walked into Verrocchio's workshop for the first time as a garzone, a studio boy, the lowest rank in the artistic hierarchy. Behind him lay the countryside of his childhood, the olive groves and rocky outcrops, the streams and birds that had been his first teachers. Before him lay Florence, the city that would complete his education and launch him toward immortality. To understand what it meant for Leonardo to enter Verrocchio's workshop in Florence in 1466, you must first understand Florence itself. This was the city at the very heart of what we now call the Renaissance, that extraordinary flowering of art, literature, philosophy, and science that would transform European culture. The city of Dante and Petrarch, of Brunelleschi's dome and Ghiberti's doors, of the Medici banking dynasty that held the city's purse strings and much of its political power. Walking through Florence in the 1460s meant encountering genius at every corner, artists and architects, poets and philosophers, mathematicians and musicians, all drawn to this single city by the concentration of wealth, the spirit of competition, and the intellectual ferment that made creation seem not just possible but necessary. The city was governed unofficially by the Medici family, particularly by Piero the Gaudi, father of the young Lorenzo who would soon become known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. The Medici had made their fortune in banking and had invested heavily in art and culture, understanding that cultural patronage was a form of political power. They filled the city with commissions, attracted artists from across Italy and beyond, fostered an environment where excellence was expected and mediocrity would not be tolerated. This was the context into which Leonardo stepped, a 14-year-old boy from the provinces, illegitimate and unlettered, but with a talent for drawing that had caught the eye of one of the city's master artists. Andrea del Verrocchio, whose workshop Leonardo entered, was not just a painter. The very name Verrocchio meant true eye, and it suited him well, for he was a man who saw clearly and worked in multiple media with equal skill. He was a sculptor in bronze and stone, a goldsmith, a painter, and engineer. His workshop, located on a street near Ser Piero's notarial office, was less like a modern art studio and more like a combination of factory, school, laboratory, and intellectual salon. Here, apprentices learned not just to paint but to work with metal and stone, to understand mathematics and geometry, to study anatomy and proportion, to design everything from church altarpieces to wedding chests to tournament armor. The workshop system of Renaissance Italy was the primary means by which artistic knowledge was transmitted from one generation to the next. A boy would enter a workshop as a garzone, essentially a servant, performing menial tasks, sweeping floors, running errands, grinding pigments, preparing panels and canvases. As he demonstrated ability, he would be promoted to apprentice proper, learning to draw from casts and from life, to prepare surfaces, to lay on base coats of paint. Eventually, if he showed real talent, he might be allowed to work on actual commission pieces under the master's supervision, painting backgrounds or minor figures while the master handled the important elements. Finally, if he proved himself truly skilled, he would become a master himself, leave to open his own workshop, and the cycle would begin again. Leonardo began at the bottom, as all apprentices did. He ground pigments, the minerals and organic materials that, when mixed with oil or egg tempera, became paint. Azurite for blues, malachite for greens, ochres for yellows and reds, lamp black from soot for darks, lead white for lights. Each pigment had to be ground to precisely the right consistency, not too coarse or it would be gritty, not too fine or it would lose its intensity. He prepared gesso grounds, the smooth white surfaces on which paintings would be executed. He learned to mix sizes and varnishes, to prepare rabbit skin glue, to understand which woods worked best for panels and why. All of this was technical knowledge, the craftsmanship that underlay art, and Verrocchio insisted his students mastered it completely. But Verrocchio's workshop offered more than technical training. It was an intellectual hub where ideas circulated as freely as pigments and preparatory drawings. Verrocchio himself was deeply interested in the new humanist learning that was spreading through Florence, the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, the emphasis on direct observation of nature rather than blind acceptance of medieval authority. His students were exposed to the work of mathematician Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who studied optics and perspective. They met Neoplatonic philosophers who gathered at the Medici court. They heard debates about the relative merits of painting versus sculpture, about the proper subjects for art, about the relationship between art and nature. Among Leonardo's fellow students and associates in the workshop were several young men who would themselves become notable artists. Sandro Botticelli had already passed through Verrocchio's orbit and was beginning to establish his own reputation. Domenico Ghirlandaio worked nearby. Pietro Perugino, who would later teach Raphael, spent time in the workshop. Lorenzo di Credi, who was almost exactly Leonardo's age, would become one of Verrocchio's most important assistants and eventually inherit control of the workshop. These young men competed with each other, learned from each other, pushed each other toward excellence. In such an environment, mediocrity was not an option. Verrocchio's teaching methods emphasized direct observation and rigorous drawing from life. His students drew endlessly, human figures from nude models, drapery studies where cloth was dipped in plaster and arranged in folds that could be studied for hours, anatomical studies of muscles and bones, perspective studies of architectural forms receding into space. Leonardo took to this training with an intensity that astonished even Verrocchio. His surviving drawings from this period show a young artist already developing an extraordinary eye for detail, an ability to capture not just the external appearance of things but their underlying structure. One type of study that Verrocchio emphasized particularly was the drapery study, drawing fabric, usually linen, that had been dipped in plaster or clay and arranged in folds. These studies taught students to understand how light revealed form, how highlights and shadows sculpted three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional surface. Leonardo's drapery studies from his time with Verrocchio are masterpieces of observation, showing fabric that seems almost to have weight and volume, folds that you feel you could reach out and touch. They were executed in a technique involving brush and ink wash on linen, sometimes with white heightening to emphasize the highlights, and they demonstrate a level of skill that few artists ever achieve. But Leonardo's genius revealed itself most clearly in his ability to move beyond mere technical proficiency to genuine innovation. The first documented example of this comes from Verrocchio's painting, The Baptism of Christ, which was probably created around 1475. According to Vasari's account, which is at least partially corroborated by stylistic analysis of the painting, Leonardo was given the task of painting one of the angels at the left side of the composition, as well as parts of the landscape background. This was standard practice. The master designed the composition and handled the most important figures, while trusted assistants filled in the secondary elements. What Leonardo produced, however, was anything but secondary. The angel he painted has a softness, a grace, a three-dimensionality that contrasts sharply with the harder, more schematic quality of Verrocchio's work in the rest of the painting. Leonardo's angel seems to exist in real space, be lit by real light that plays across its features and creates subtle gradations of tone. The landscape he painted shows a mastery of atmospheric perspective, the way distant objects appear less distinct and more blue-toned than near objects due to the scattering of light by the atmosphere. These were revolutionary techniques, and even in these early years, Leonardo was already pushing beyond what his teacher had taught him. Vasari claims that when Verrocchio saw what Leonardo had accomplished, he was so impressed, or perhaps so humbled, that he put down his brushes and never painted again, devoting himself thereafter entirely to sculpture. This is almost certainly an exaggeration. Verrocchio continued to design paintings that were executed by his workshop, and he had always preferred sculpture to painting anyway. But the story captures something real. Leonardo's talent was so obvious, so exceptional, that even his master recognized he had taught the young man everything he could. Leonardo remained in Verrocchio's workshop longer than most apprentices. He was accepted into the Painters' Guild, the Compagnia di San Luca, in 1472, which gave him the right to work independently. But he stayed with Verrocchio for 5 more years, until 1477 or 78, working not as a student but as a colleague and assistant on various projects. During this time he worked not only with Verrocchio but also in the nearby workshop of Antonio Pollaiuolo, a sculptor, painter, and engraver known for his dynamic depictions of the human body in motion. Pollaiuolo's influence can be seen in Leonardo's developing interest in anatomy and in the twisting, serpentine poses that would characterize his figure drawings. By around 1478, Leonardo set up his own studio in Florence. He was 26 years old, a fully trained artist with extraordinary skills and an already developing reputation. He began to receive independent commissions, though none of his early independent works survives complete. The most important of these early commissions came in 1481, when the Augustinian monks of San Donato a Scopito, just outside Florence, commissioned him to paint an altarpiece showing the adoration of the Magi. This was Leonardo's chance to prove himself as a master in his own right. He threw himself into the project with characteristic intensity, producing dozens of preparatory drawings, studying compositions, experimenting with arrangements of figures. The preparatory drawings that survive show a mind grappling with complex problems of narrative, composition, and emotional expression. How do you show the moment when the Magi, those wise men from the East, first recognize the Christ child? How do you convey the excitement, the wonder, the cascading emotion that spreads through the crowd? How do you arrange dozens of figures in a coherent composition that leads the eye to the central point while still giving each figure individual character and emotion? Leonardo's solution was revolutionary. Instead of the traditional orderly arrangement where figures are lined up in rows like actors on a stage, he created a swirling, dynamic composition where figures push forward, gesture dramatically, react to the central event with individual variations of emotion. The background would show not a static stable but a complex architectural setting with ruins and horsemen. The whole painting would be a unified narrative moment, frozen in time but alive with movement and emotion. He began the actual painting on a large wooden panel, working in what appears to be a monochrome underpainting, establishing the composition and the patterns of light and dark before adding color. And then in 1482 he stopped. The Adoration of the Magi remained unfinished, abandoned when Leonardo left Florence for Milan. The monks eventually commissioned another artist to paint a replacement. Leonardo's unfinished panel, with its brown underpainting showing the ghostly forms of figures and horses and architectural elements, survives today in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, a tantalizing glimpse of what might have been. Why did Leonardo leave Florence just when he was establishing himself? The answer lies in the nature of Leonardo's ambition and curiosity. Florence was a great city, but it was also a crowded field. Competition for commissions was intense. The Medici family patronized many artists, but they had their favorites, and Leonardo, still relatively young and unproven, was not yet among them. Moreover, Leonardo's interests were already expanding beyond painting. He was fascinated by mathematics and geometry, by the mechanics of how things moved, by the possibility of creating machines that could harness natural forces. In Florence, he was an artist. In Milan, he could be something more. In 1482, Leonardo wrote a letter to Ludovico Sforza, the de facto ruler of Milan, essentially a job application. The letter, which survives, is remarkable for what it reveals about Leonardo's self-conception. He lists his abilities and he mentions painting almost as an afterthought. First, he describes himself as a military engineer who can design portable bridges, siege machines, cannon, armored vehicles, underwater sabotage equipment. Only at the end does he add, almost casually, that he can also paint and sculpt as well as any man. This letter was Leonardo announcing that he was not merely an artist but a universal genius, a man whose abilities transcended any single category. Ludovico Sforza apparently agreed. Leonardo left Florence, left his unfinished Adoration, and traveled north to Milan, to the court of one of Italy's most powerful rulers, to begin the most productive period of his life. Milan in 1482 was a different world from Florence. Where Florence was a republic, theoretically governed by its citizens, Milan was ruled by the Sforza family with an iron hand. Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moor, for his dark complexion, was not yet officially the Duke. That title belonged to his young nephew John Galeazzo, whose regent Ludovico ostensibly was. In practice, however, Ludovico was the absolute ruler of one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in Italy, and he maintained his position through a combination of political skill, military strength, and lavish cultural patronage designed to legitimize his somewhat questionable authority. The Sforza court was magnificent, glittering, and dangerous. Ludovico's castle in Milan was a fortress and a palace combined, with walls thick enough to withstand siege, towers from which guards could see for miles, and interior apartments decorated with frescoes and filled with precious objects. The court attracted artists, poets, musicians, mathematicians, and philosophers from across Europe. Ludovico spent lavishly on culture not out of mere love of art, but because cultural brilliance conferred political legitimacy. If he could make Milan the greatest artistic center in Italy, who would question his right to rule? Into this environment came Leonardo da Vinci, 30 years old, his letter of introduction claiming expertise in military engineering and only secondarily mentioning his abilities as an artist. Ludovico accepted Leonardo into his service, and Leonardo would remain in Milan for the next 17 years, the longest continuous period he would spend in any single place in his entire life. At first, Leonardo's duties were varied and sometimes surprising. He designed sets and costumes for court festivals, those elaborate spectacles that combine theater, music, dance, and special effects to celebrate weddings, military victories, visits from foreign dignitaries. He painted portraits of court ladies and dignitaries. He was consulted on military matters, though most of his military inventions remained on paper rather than being built. He designed fortifications, proposed improvements to Milan's canals, investigated the city's sanitation problems, and proposed solutions. He was, in short, exactly what he had claimed to be, a universal genius available for any task Ludovico might require. But one task dominated Leonardo's first decade in Milan: the creation of a colossal bronze equestrian statue honoring Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, the mercenary general who had seized control of Milan and founded the Sforza dynasty. This statue, which became known as the Gran Cavallo or Great Horse, was to be the largest bronze sculpture ever created, perhaps twice life-size, showing Francesco Sforza mounted on a rearing horse. It was a technically daunting challenge requiring not just artistic skill but engineering expertise in metallurgy, casting, and structural mechanics. Leonardo threw himself into the project with characteristic intensity. He dissected horses to understand their anatomy, filled pages of his notebooks with studies of equine muscle structure, sketched horses from every angle, studied how they moved and how their weight shifted as they reared. He read everything he could find about bronze casting, consulted with foundry workers, calculated the amount of bronze that would be needed and the best techniques for creating such a massive cast. He built a full-scale clay model, which contemporaries described as magnificent, a perfect synthesis of power and grace that captured the spirit of the warrior on horseback. And then the whole project collapsed. The bronze that had been gathered for the statue, more than 70 tons of it, was requisitioned by Ludovico in 1494 to cast cannon for Milan's defense. Italy was descending into warfare as the French King Charles VIII invaded, and bronze for weapons took precedence over bronze for monuments. Leonardo's clay model stood in a courtyard of the Sforza castle for years, deteriorating in the weather. In 1499, when French forces finally conquered Milan, their crossbowmen used the giant horse for target practice, destroying it completely. All that remains of Leonardo's Gran Cavallo are his preparatory drawings and descriptions from contemporaries. The statue he spent more than a decade designing was never cast, never realized in metal. It was the first of many projects Leonardo would abandon unfinished, a pattern that would frustrate his patrons and biographers for centuries. But if the Gran Cavallo was never completed, other projects were, and it is from Leonardo's Milan period that his reputation as one of the greatest artists who ever lived primarily derives. For it was in Milan that Leonardo painted The Last Supper, one of the most famous and influential works of art in human history. The commission came from Ludovico Sforza around 1494 or 95. Ludovico was renovating the church of Santa Maria del Grazie and its attached Dominican monastery, which he intended to use as a mausoleum for the Sforza family. The renovation included painting the refectory, the room where the monks took their meals. The obvious subject for a refectory wall was the Last Supper, showing Christ and his apostles at their final meal together before the crucifixion. It was a traditional subject, painted in refectories across Europe. What Leonardo would do with it was anything but traditional. But before we explore the Last Supper in detail, we need to understand the broader intellectual and artistic environment in Milan that made such revolutionary work possible. The Sforza court, despite its political intrigues and military concerns, fostered genuine intellectual inquiry. Leonardo found colleagues and friends who shared his interests. Particularly important was the mathematician Luca Pacioli, a Franciscan friar and one of the greatest mathematicians of the age. Pacioli arrived in Milan in 1496 and immediately formed a close friendship with Leonardo. The two men collaborated on projects, discussed geometry and proportion, explored the mathematical principles underlying both art and nature. Pacioli was working on a book about mathematical proportion, which would be published in 1498 with the title De Divina Proportion, on the divine proportion. Leonardo provided illustrations for the book, including beautiful drawings of geometric solids that combined mathematical precision with artistic elegance. More importantly, Pacioli's ideas about mathematics influenced Leonardo's thinking about art and nature. Both men believed that mathematics was not just an abstract system but the key to understanding the deepest truths about reality, that number and proportion governed everything from the growth of plants to the movement of planets to the beauty of the human face. Leonardo's notebooks from the Milan period show a mind ranging over an astonishing variety of subjects. He studied botany, filling pages with detailed drawings of plants and speculations about how plants grow and how leaves are arranged to catch the maximum light. He studied geology, observing rock formations and theorizing about how mountains were formed and how fossils ended up on mountaintops far from the sea. He studied optics, investigating how light travels, how lenses work, how the eye perceives color and distance. He studied anatomy, though his most intensive anatomical work would come later. He designed machines, flying machines based on the flight of birds, submarines, tanks, automated manufacturing equipment, water-lifting devices, anything his restless mind could imagine. His workshop in Milan became a gathering place for students and assistants. Young artists came to learn from the master, and Leonardo seems to have been a generous teacher, allowing students to copy his works and involving them in his projects. Among his most devoted students were Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio, who became an excellent portrait painter in his own right, and Marco Diagiono, who would later make copies of Leonardo's works. But the student who meant the most to Leonardo was a young man known as Salai, Little Devil, whose real name was John Giacomo Caprati. Salai entered Leonardo's household as a 10-year-old boy around 1490 and remained with Leonardo for the rest of the artist's life, first as student, then as assistant, and finally as something like an adopted son and heir. The relationship between Leonardo and Salai has been the subject of much speculation. We know that Leonardo complained in his notebooks about Salai's bad behavior. He was a thief, a liar, greedy and obstinate. Yet Leonardo kept him close, paid for his clothes and education, included him in his household year after year. When Leonardo died, Salai inherited property and money. Whether their relationship was merely that of master and adopted son or something more intimate is uncertain, lost in the privacy of 5 centuries ago. The court of Milan was also the setting for one of the most important relationships in Leonardo's life. His friendship with Duchess Beatrice d'Este, Ludovico's young wife. Beatrice was only 15 when she married Ludovico in 1491, but she quickly became a force at court, known for her intelligence, her love of learning, and her support for artists and intellectuals. She and Leonardo seem to have developed a genuine mutual respect. Beatrice is known to have commissioned work from Leonardo, including a portrait that has since been lost. When she died suddenly in 1497, giving birth to a stillborn child at only 22 years old, the entire court went into mourning. Ludovico was devastated, and his grief may have contributed to the political mistakes that would soon cost him his duchy. Life in Milan for Leonardo was comfortable but never without challenge. He maintained a household that included not just himself but his assistants and students, which required organization and resources. We know from his notebooks that he kept detailed accounts of expenses, lists of purchases made at markets, payments to models and assistants, costs for materials like pigments and paper and panels. These mundane records give us glimpses into the daily reality of an artist's life. He bought wine and bread, charcoal for drawing, sheets of copper for engraving, fine linen for painting surfaces. He paid boys to pose for hours while he drew their faces from different angles. He purchased animals, birds, cats, even a bear at one point, so he could study them for his drawings. His notebooks from the Milan period also reveal something of his personal habits and peculiarities. He was apparently a vegetarian, unusual for his time, motivated it seems by compassion for animals. He would buy caged birds in the market just to release them, delighting in watching them fly free. He dressed well, we know, spending considerable sums on fine clothing and taking care with his appearance. Several contemporary accounts describe him as handsome and elegant, with a long beard that became his trademark in later life. He was strong physically despite spending so much time at intellectual pursuits, capable of bending horseshoes with his bare hands according to at least one admiring contemporary. His working methods were irregular by the standards of most workshops. He did not maintain regular hours, did not work steadily on a single project until completion. Instead, he worked in bursts of intense activity followed by periods of what looked like idleness but was actually deep thought. He would work on one project for days, then suddenly shift to something completely different, from painting to engineering, from anatomy to geometry, following his interests and his intuitions rather than any systematic plan. This made him frustrating to patrons who wanted work completed on schedule, but it was essential to how his mind functioned. For Leonardo, everything was connected. The laws governing how water flows were related to the principles of painting. Atmospheric perspective were related to the structure of the human circulatory system. To understand any one thing completely, he needed to understand everything, and so he moved from subject to subject, following threads of connection that only he could see. Leonardo's life in Milan was comfortable and productive. He lived in a house provided by Ludovico, received a regular salary, had access to materials and assistance for his projects. He painted portraits and altarpieces, though many of these are now lost or of disputed attribution. He worked on the Grand Cavallo. He designed court festivals and pageants. He investigated mathematics and natural philosophy. He filled notebook after notebook with drawings and observations. And he painted the Last Supper, but that remarkable achievement deserves its own section. Milan in the 1490s was one of the great courts of Europe, a center of power and culture, and Leonardo had found his place within it. He was no longer merely a painter but a court artist, an engineer, a universal man whose abilities were recognized and rewarded. The years in Milan represent the full flowering of Leonardo's genius, the period when his diverse talents found expression and when he created some of his most enduring works. When political disaster overtook the Sforzo state, when French armies conquered Milan and drove Ludovico into exile and imprisonment where he would die, Leonardo's comfortable world collapsed. But before that collapse came the Last Supper, and to that masterpiece we now turn our attention. The refectory of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan is a long rectangular room with a barrel-vaulted ceiling. When Leonardo stood before its north wall sometime in 1495, commissioned to paint the traditional Last Supper scene, he faced both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity was obvious. This was a major commission from one of Italy's most powerful rulers, a chance to create a work that would be seen by the Dominican monks every day as they took their meals, a chance to make a statement about his abilities as an artist. The challenge was equally obvious. How do you take a subject that had been painted hundreds of times before and make it new, make it memorable, make it say something that had never been said quite that way before? Leonardo's solution was revolutionary, and to understand why, we need to consider what Last Supper paintings typically looked like before Leonardo. The traditional formula was relatively simple. Christ sits at the center of a long table, the 12 apostles arranged on either side, usually with Judas isolated on the viewer's side of the table to make his identity clear. The scene is static, contemplative, showing the institution of the Eucharist, Christ blessing the bread and wine that will become, in Catholic theology, his body and blood. There is little drama, little emotion, little sense of a specific moment frozen in time. Leonardo rejected this formula completely. Instead of showing the peaceful moment of institution, he chose to depict the instant immediately after Christ has spoken the words, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." This is the moment of maximum drama, when the apostles react with shock, confusion, denial, anger, grief. Instead of showing 12 men sitting passively, Leonardo shows 12 distinct individuals, each reacting in a way consistent with what the Gospels tell us about their personalities. The painting captures a psychological moment, the instant when peace shatters and the reality of betrayal and coming death crashes into the consciousness of Christ's closest followers. The composition is brilliantly organized. The apostles are arranged in 4 groups of 3, with Christ isolated at the center. This arrangement is not random but carefully calculated to lead the eye through the painting while maintaining perfect balance. On Christ's right, the viewer's left, are Bartholomew, James the Lesser, and Andrew, all leaning forward, reacting to Christ's words with gestures of surprise and disbelief. Next comes Judas, Peter, and John, the group closest to Christ where the drama is most intense. Judas is shown recoiling, clutching the money bag that marks him as the treasurer and foreshadows his 30 pieces of silver, his face cast in shadow while the others are lit. Peter leans forward aggressively, hand gripping a knife. He will later cut off a soldier's ear trying to defend Christ, demanding of John, "Tell us who it is that he means." John, traditionally the youngest and Christ's favorite, is shown not leaning on Christ's breast as in older depictions but pulling back, overwhelmed by emotion, his hands folded in a gesture that suggests both prayer and resignation. On Christ's left are Thomas, James the Greater, and Philip. Thomas is shown raising his finger, a gesture that will become his trademark in art as doubting Thomas, questioning, demanding evidence. James the Greater spreads his arms wide in a gesture of shocked denial. Philip brings his hands to his chest in a gesture that seems to say, "Surely, Lord, it is not I?" Finally, at the far end, Matthew, Thaddeus, and Simon discuss among themselves, trying to understand what has just happened, what it means, their gestures animated by confusion and concern. The whole composition is unified by the architectural setting, which is one of Leonardo's most brilliant inventions. He painted a perspectival space that appears to extend the actual room of the refectory, creating the illusion that Christ and the apostles are sitting at a table in a room beyond the wall. The painted ceiling beams align with the real ceiling beams of the refectory. The painted side walls recede at angles that match the real walls. 3 windows in the back wall of the painted space let in light that appears to come from the actual windows in the refectory. The whole composition creates a unified spatial box that seems to contain real figures in real space. But Leonardo being Leonardo, even this architectural perfection contains paradoxes that scholars still debate. The vanishing point of the perspective, the point where all the receding lines meet, is placed exactly at Christ's right temple, marking him as the central focus of the entire composition. But the eye level implied by the perspective is higher than the actual eye level of someone standing in the refectory, creating a slight distortion that makes the table seem to tip forward and the apostles seem to press toward the picture plane. Moreover, the table itself is impossibly large, too large to fit in the painted room, not large enough to actually seat 13 people along 3 sides in the arrangement shown. These are not mistakes but deliberate choices, ways Leonardo manipulated perspective to create emotional and compositional effects rather than mere optical accuracy. The technique Leonardo used was as revolutionary as the composition. Traditional fresco painting, the technique normally used for wall paintings, required the artist to paint on wet plaster, working quickly before the plaster dried, applying color in broad zones. This technique produced durable paintings that became part of the wall itself, but it required speed and prevented subtle gradations of tone and color. Leonardo wanted something different. He wanted to work slowly, to add layer after layer of thin paint, to achieve the subtle transitions of tone and color that characterized his panel paintings. So he experimented with a mixed technique, apparently tempera and oil on a dry plaster wall prepared with a special ground. The technique allowed him to work as he wanted, slowly and carefully, returning again and again to specific passages, adjusting tones, adding details, creating the subtle modeling of forms that makes his figures seem three-dimensional. But it was a disaster for the painting's longevity. By painting on dry plaster, Leonardo prevented the paint from bonding permanently with the wall. Almost immediately after completion, the painting began to deteriorate. Within 50 years, it was already in serious trouble. Within 200 years, it was nearly ruined. Napoleon's troops, occupying Milan in the late 18th century, used the refectory as a stable and target practice area, scratching graffiti into the wall and tossing things at the painting. In World War II, a bomb destroyed the roof of the refectory, leaving the Last Supper exposed to the elements for several years. Multiple attempts at restoration, some well-intentioned but misguided, others frankly disastrous, have altered the painting dramatically. The most recent restoration, completed in 1999 after more than 20 years of work, attempted to remove all later additions and repaintings and recover whatever original paint still survived. The result is controversial. Some art historians celebrate it as recovery of Leonardo's original vision. Others argue that so much original paint was lost that what we see now is more reconstruction than Leonardo. Less than half of the painted surface is generally agreed to be from Leonardo's own hand. Yet even in its damaged state, The Last Supper remains one of the most powerful and influential works of art ever created. Its influence on subsequent painters was immediate and profound. Within years, artists across Italy were adopting Leonardo's compositional strategies, his attention to psychological drama, his use of gesture and expression to convey inner states. The painting became, in the words of one contemporary, a symbol of man's burning desire for salvation, a statement not just about a biblical event but about human nature itself, about betrayal and loyalty, about knowledge and ignorance, about the moment when everything changes and nothing will ever be the same. Leonardo's working method on The Last Supper became legendary during his lifetime. The prior of the monastery complained to Ludovico that Leonardo was lazy, that he would sometimes stand staring at the painting for hours without adding a stroke, that he would arrive at the refectory, make a few brush strokes, and leave for days. Leonardo's response, recorded by contemporaries, was that genius cannot be rushed, that he was working even when not physically painting, thinking through problems, imagining solutions. He said that if the prior continued to pressure him, he would use the prior's face as the model for Judas, a threat that apparently silenced the complaint. The painting was completed in early 1498, after about 3 years of work. By that time, Italy was descending into the chaos that would destroy the Sforza state. In 1499, French armies conquered Milan. Ludovico fled, was captured, and died in a French prison. Leonardo's comfortable existence at the Sforza court was over. He would soon leave Milan, beginning a period of wandering that would take him to Venice, back to Florence, to Rome, and eventually to France. But The Last Supper remained, despite its deteriorating condition, despite wars and occupations, despite Napoleon's stables and Hitler's bombs, despite misguided restorations and modern pollution. It remained as testimony to what Leonardo could achieve when art and intellect combined, when observation and imagination merged, when technical skill served a vision of human nature that was both specific to a historical moment and universal to all time. In that refectory in Milan, Leonardo did more than paint 13 men at a table. He captured the moment when knowledge breaks through ignorance, when the future casts its shadow over the present, when humans confront truths they cannot accept and must accept anyway. He created, in short, one of the supreme achievements of Renaissance art, and by extension, one of the supreme achievements of human creativity itself. After the fall of Milan in 1499, Leonardo's life entered a period of uncertainty and movement. He left the city where he had spent 17 relatively stable and productive years. He traveled briefly to Mantua, where he drew a portrait of Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness, who would spend years trying unsuccessfully to convince him to paint her portrait in oils. He went to Venice, where he was consulted about military defenses against the threat of Turkish invasion. Finally, in 1500, he returned to Florence, the city where he had trained 30 years earlier, now coming back as a famous master whose reputation preceded him. Florence had changed in Leonardo's absence. The Medici had been expelled in 1494, and the city had fallen under the spell of the monk Girolamo Savonarola, whose apocalyptic preaching and moral crusades had culminated in the bonfire of the Vanities, where Florentines burned books, artworks, and luxury goods in a frenzy of repentance. Savonarola himself had been executed in 1498, but his influence lingered. The city was now a republic again, nominally free, actually torn by factions and struggling to maintain its independence in an Italy racked by war. Leonardo, now 48 years old, established himself in Florence but initially struggled to find major commissions. He was famous, certainly, but his reputation for leaving works unfinished preceded him. The adoration of the Magi still sat incomplete in Verrocchio's old workshop. Patrons were understandably hesitant to commission major works from an artist who might never finish them. Leonardo occupied himself with mathematical studies, with plans for various engineering projects, with preliminary work on treatises about painting and anatomy that he would never complete. And he began a small portrait that would, in time, become the most famous painting in the world. The commission came from Francesco del Giocondo, a successful Florentine silk merchant and official, sometime around 1500 or 1503. Scholars debate the exact date. Francesco wanted a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini, known more formally as Lisa del Giocondo. Hence the Italian name for the painting, La Gioconda, and its French equivalent, La Joconde. Lisa came from a respectable Florentine family, the Gherardini, who owned land in the Chianti countryside. She had married Francesco young, probably around 15 or 16, and by the time of the portrait commission had borne him several children, though not all had survived. Why Francesco commissioned the portrait is uncertain. Some scholars believe it was to celebrate the purchase of a new house in 1503. Others suggest it commemorated the birth of their second son, Andrea, in December 1502, or perhaps mourned the death of a daughter in 1499. Or perhaps Francesco simply wanted a portrait of his wife, something wealthy merchants were increasingly commissioning in the prosperous Florence of the early 1600s. Leonardo began the portrait in his studio, working in oil on a poplar wood panel. The format was traditional, a half-length portrait showing the subject from roughly the waist up, hands visible, seated in a three-quarter view rather than the profile view that had been standard for portraits earlier in the century. The setting was semi-outdoor, with the sitter in the foreground and a distant landscape visible behind her. All of this was conventional. What Leonardo did with these conventional elements was anything but. First, there was the pose. Leonardo placed Lisa in a seated position, her body turned slightly to her right, her face turning back toward the viewer, her hands folded at the lower right of the composition. This pyramidal composition was stable and balanced, but the slight turn of the body and face created a sense of movement, of a woman who has just turned to look at something, perhaps the painter, perhaps us, the viewers. Her right arm rests on the arm of a chair, clearly visible. Her left hand lies over her right wrist in a gesture of relaxation and composure. Then there was the face. Here Leonardo deployed the full range of his technical skills, the years of observation and practice, to create something unprecedented. The modeling of the face is extraordinarily subtle, created through countless thin layers of oil paint applied one over another, each layer so thin as to be nearly transparent, building up color and tone gradually until the face seems to glow with inner light. Leonardo's technique, known as sfumato from the Italian word for smoke, eliminated harsh lines and created soft transitions between areas of light and shadow. There are no sharp edges in Lisa's face, no clear boundaries where one tone ends and another begins. Everything flows, everything blends, everything suggests three-dimensional form occupying real space. The eyes are painted with particular care. They meet the viewer's gaze directly, and there is a quality to them, a sense of awareness and intelligence, that seems almost uncanny. The right eye appears to look directly at us no matter where we stand. The left eye seems slightly different, slightly harder to read. Is she looking past us? To us? At something behind us? The asymmetry is subtle but effective, creating a sense that this is a real person with a real inner life, not just a painted image. And then there is the smile. That famous, enigmatic, endlessly discussed smile that has launched 1,000 interpretations. It is not a broad smile, not the kind of open expression we see in earlier portraits. It is subtle, restrained, playing at the corners of her mouth, suggesting amusement or contentment or secret knowledge or perhaps all of these at once. Interestingly, the smile is much more visible in peripheral vision than when looked at directly, a consequence of the way Leonardo painted it with very subtle tonal transitions that our eye's peripheral vision is better at detecting than our central, detailed vision. The background landscape is as extraordinary as the figure. Leonardo painted a vast, almost alien vista of lakes and rivers, mountains and valleys, bridges and winding roads. The two sides of the painting show the landscape at slightly different eye levels, creating a subtle asymmetry that some have suggested represents two different regions synthesized into one impossible vista. The colors shift from greens and browns in the foreground to blues and pale greens in the distance, demonstrating Leonardo's understanding of atmospheric perspective. The way air scatters light and makes distant objects appear more blue and less distinct than near objects. But who was this woman really? The identification with Lisa Gherardini comes from Giorgio Vasari's account written in 1550, more than 30 years after Leonardo's death. Vasari claimed that Leonardo painted Lisa's portrait for her husband Francesco del Giocondo and worked on it for 4 years but left it unfinished when he departed for France. Vasari describes details, the veins at her temples, the subtle coloring of the skin, the tiny hairs at her eyebrows, that suggest he had seen the painting or talked to people who had. Modern scholarship, including the discovery in 2005 of a marginal note by Agostino Vespucci, cousin of the famous explorer Amerigo Vespucci, dated October 1503, strongly supports the identification with Lisa Gherardini. Vespucci, who knew Leonardo, wrote that the artist was working on a portrait of Lisa del Giocondo and compared it to works by the ancient Greek painter Apelles. This near-contemporary testimony is powerful evidence. Yet the painting itself resists simple identification. There are no jewels, no elaborate dress, no symbols of wealth or status visible in the painting. The sitter wears relatively simple clothing, a dark dress with a gauzy veil over her hair. She has no jewelry except for a possible ring on her left hand. She sits in an enigmatic setting with no clear indication of location or time. Is this really a merchant's wife, or has Leonardo abstracted the portrait into something more universal? The painting's history is unusual and helps explain how it became so famous. Leonardo apparently never gave the painting to Francesco del Giocondo. Instead, he kept working on it, perhaps for years, refining it, adjusting it, unable or unwilling to call it finished and hand it over. He took it with him when he left Florence in 1506 to return to Milan at the request of the French governor Charles d'Amboise. He had it with him during his later travels to Rome and eventually to France. King Francis I, who invited Leonardo to France in 1516, apparently purchased it from him for 4,000 gold écus, an enormous sum, and it entered the French royal collection. The painting remained in French royal collections through the centuries, surviving the French Revolution when the royal collections became property of the state. Napoleon hung it in his bedroom for a time. In 1804, it was moved to the newly opened Louvre Museum, where it has remained ever since, except for a brief period in 1911-13 when it was stolen and returned. That theft, more than anything else, catapulted the Mona Lisa to true worldwide fame. On August 21, 1911, museum workers arrived at the Louvre to discover that the painting was gone, removed from the wall overnight. The French police investigated, suspecting everyone from the poet Guillaume Apollinaire to the painter Pablo Picasso. The international press covered the story extensively. Reward money was offered. The painting appeared in cartoons, popular songs, advertisements. Its absence made it more famous than its presence ever had. 2 years later, the thief, an Italian handyman named Vincenzo Perugia who had worked at the Louvre and claimed he stole the painting to return it to Italy, tried to sell it to an art dealer in Florence. He was caught, the painting recovered. It toured Italy to enormous crowds before returning to the Louvre, where it has remained behind bulletproof glass ever since, the most visited and most valuable painting in the world. Leonardo worked on the Mona Lisa intermittently for the rest of his life, adding tiny touches, adjusting tones, refining details. Some art historians believe that the painting as it exists today contains work from as late as 1517, just 2 years before Leonardo's death, meaning he worked on it for more than a decade. This extended working period explains some of the painting's extraordinary qualities. Layer after layer of thin oil paint, each layer adjusted based on how the previous layers looked, created a depth and luminosity that cannot be achieved by painting alla prima, all at once. The painting became a kind of meditation for Leonardo, a laboratory for exploring the possibilities of oil painting, a vehicle for thinking about portraiture, about human expression, about the relationship between figure and landscape. It is this quality, the sense that the painting embodies years of thought and refinement, that every square inch has been considered and reconsidered, that nothing is there by accident, that gives the Mona Lisa its peculiar power. It is not the most dramatic of paintings. It does not show a biblical narrative or classical myth. It is simply a portrait of a woman who may have been a merchant's wife in Florence, and yet it has become an icon recognized instantly by people who know nothing else about art history. The painting transcended its origins, becoming what Leonardo perhaps intended it to be, a perfect synthesis of observation and imagination, technique and thought, the particular and the universal. For Leonardo, art and science were not separate disciplines but different aspects of the same quest, to understand how the world works, to penetrate beneath surfaces to the underlying structures and principles, to see truth clearly and represent it accurately. Nowhere is this unity of art and science more evident than in his anatomical studies, which represent perhaps his greatest contribution to human knowledge, though during his lifetime almost no one saw them. Leonardo's anatomical interests began early, as part of his artistic training. To paint the human body convincingly, Renaissance artists needed to understand its structure, how bones connected, how muscles attached and flexed, how the body moved and balanced. Artists regularly attended dissections at medical schools, taking notes and making sketches. They studied living models, having them hold poses for hours while the artist drew. They measured proportions and memorized formulas. The head is 1/8 of total height, the arm span equals the height, the foot is 1/6 of the height, and so on. But Leonardo's anatomical interests went far beyond what was useful for an artist. He wanted to understand not just the external form of the body but its internal machinery, not just how it looked but how it worked. What made blood flow? How did the heart pump? What were the pathways of the nerves? How did muscles contract to move bones? How did the eye receive and process light? How did the brain store memories and generate thoughts? How did the reproductive system create new life? These were questions that went to the heart of what it meant to be human, and Leonardo pursued them with a passion that consumed years of his life. His first significant anatomical study involved a human skull, which he acquired in 1489 while in Milan. This was a remarkable opportunity. Human remains were difficult to obtain, as dissection was controversial and in some places forbidden, though not as strictly as often assumed. Leonardo sectioned the skull in various ways, sawing through it to reveal its internal structure, studying it from every angle. He made exquisitely detailed drawings showing the skull from different perspectives, sectioned to reveal the structure of the nasal cavity, the eye sockets, the channels through which nerves and blood vessels passed. What particularly interested Leonardo were the locations where, according to medieval and Renaissance anatomical theory, the various mental functions were located. Following the ancient physician Galen and the medieval elaborations of his work, anatomists believed that the brain contained 3 connected chambers or ventricles. The front ventricle housed the common sense, where all sensory information was integrated. The middle ventricle housed imagination and reason. The rear ventricle housed memory. Leonardo drew diagrams trying to locate these ventricles in the skull, drilling holes and pouring wax into them to create casts of their shape. We know now that this theory was wrong, that mental functions are not localized in ventricles but in the brain tissue itself, and that the ventricles are simply fluid-filled spaces. But Leonardo was working with the tools and theories available to him, and what matters is not whether he got the right answer but that he asked the question scientifically, using observation and experiment rather than simply accepting ancient authority. After this first intensive study of the skull, Leonardo's anatomical research appears to have lapsed for about 20 years. He was busy with other projects: the Last Supper, court festivities, the Gran Cavallo, mathematical studies, engineering schemes. But around 1506, when he was back in Milan after his return from Florence, his anatomical studies resumed with new intensity and sophistication. The turning point came in the winter of 1508. Leonardo was in Florence, staying at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova, when an old man was brought in. Leonardo spoke with him, and the man claimed to be over 100 years old. He felt well, he said, just weak. That night, sitting in his bed, without pain or distress, the old man died. Leonardo recorded in his notebook, "This old man, a few hours before his death, told me that he was over 100 years old, and that he felt nothing wrong with his body other than weakness." And thus, while sitting on a bed in the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, without any movement or sign of distress, he passed from this life. Leonardo then dissected the old man's body, carefully removing organs, tracing blood vessels, examining tissues. He was looking for the cause of such a peaceful death at such a great age. What he found astonished him. The arteries were thickened and narrowed, especially those leading to the heart. The liver was discolored and damaged. Leonardo was observing and recording, probably for the first time in history, the effects of what we now call arteriosclerosis and cirrhosis. He wrote detailed descriptions of these conditions and made drawings showing the narrowed arteries and damaged organs with stunning accuracy. He didn't stop there. For comparison, Leonardo dissected a 2-year-old child who had recently died. He found the child's arteries to be flexible and open, the organs healthy and normally colored. The contrast allowed him to understand that the old man's condition was not normal but pathological, the result of disease and aging. This comparative method, examining different specimens to understand what was normal and what was pathological, what was typical and what was exceptional, would become central to Leonardo's anatomical research. Over the next several years, working at hospitals and medical schools in Florence, Milan, and Rome, Leonardo dissected approximately 30 human cadavers and many more animals. He worked primarily at night, by candlelight, as decomposition was rapid and refrigeration did not exist. The work was physically unpleasant and emotionally draining. Leonardo wrote of the difficulty, "Though possessed of an interest in the subject, you may perhaps be deterred by natural repugnance, or if this does not restrain you, then perhaps by the fear of passing the night hours in the company of these corpses, quartered and flayed and horrible to behold." But he persisted, driven by a passion to understand. He studied the bones, learning their precise shapes and how they articulated. He filled pages with drawings of skulls from every angle, showing how the dome of the cranium fit together like pieces of a puzzle, how the jaw articulated with the skull, how the teeth were rooted in the bone. He studied the spine, drawing each vertebra individually and then in sequence, understanding how they stacked to form a flexible column that supported the body while allowing movement. He studied joints, the ball and socket joint of the hip, the hinge joint of the knee, the complex pivot joint of the ankle, drawing them from multiple angles, often showing them exploded or sectioned to reveal their internal structure. He studied the muscles with even greater intensity, producing drawings that remain unsurpassed for their combination of accuracy and beauty. He understood that muscles worked in opposing pairs, that when one contracted, its opposite relaxed, that the complex movements of the human body resulted from the coordinated action of dozens of muscles working together. He drew muscles in layers, first showing the deepest muscles close to the bone, then progressively showing the layers above them, building up to the surface musculature that determined external form. These layered drawings were revolutionary, allowing the viewer to understand not just what muscles looked like but how they were organized, how they worked together, how they produced movement. He studied the organs, heart, liver, lungs, stomach, intestines, bladder, kidneys, with the same systematic thoroughness. His drawings of the heart showed not just its external form but its internal chambers and valves. He understood that the heart had 4 chambers and that blood flowed through them in a specific sequence, though he didn't fully grasp the complete circuit of circulation that William Harvey would describe a century later. He made the first accurate drawings of the valves in the veins that prevent blood from flowing backward. He understood that the beating of the heart created pressure that moved blood through the vessels, rejecting the ancient theory that the heart heated the blood like a furnace. His reproductive studies were particularly advanced. He made detailed drawings of the fetus in the womb, showing it curled in its natural position, connected to the mother by the umbilical cord. These drawings were based on dissecting a pregnant cow, but Leonardo correctly understood that human development followed similar principles. He drew the female reproductive system with remarkable accuracy, showing the uterus, ovaries, and associated structures. He understood that human reproduction involved the mixing of male and female contributions, though his understanding of the specific mechanisms was limited by the lack of microscopes and the cellular theory that would not be developed for centuries. He studied the nerves and blood vessels, trying to trace their pathways through the body. This was extraordinarily difficult work, as nerves and vessels are delicate structures easily damaged in dissection, and Leonardo lacked the preservation techniques and microscopes that modern anatomists take for granted. Nevertheless, he produced drawings showing major nerve pathways from the brain and spinal cord to various parts of the body, and drawings showing the major arteries and veins. He understood that nerves carried signals from the brain to muscles, making movement possible, and from sense organs to the brain, making perception possible. He even studied the eye in minute detail, attempting to understand how it focused light and created images. He dissected eyes from various animals and from humans, drawing the lens, the iris, the retina, the optic nerve. He conducted experiments with camera obscuras, dark chambers with a small hole that allowed light to enter and create an inverted image on the far wall, trying to understand the relationship between optical instruments and the eye itself. He theorized that the eye worked like a camera obscura, with light entering through the pupil and creating an image on the retina, which was essentially correct though he got some details wrong. His technique was revolutionary. Unlike earlier anatomical illustrators who typically showed a single view of a body part with labels pointing to various structures, Leonardo showed the same structure from multiple viewpoints: front, back, side, sectioned, exploded to show layers. He invented what we now call exploded view drawings, where parts are shown separated from each other but in their correct relative positions, allowing the viewer to understand how they fit together. He used conventions from architectural and engineering drawing, guidelines, registration marks, perspective projection, to make his anatomical drawings clear and comprehensible. The result is a body of work that stands as one of the great achievements in the history of scientific illustration. Leonardo's anatomical drawings are not just accurate but beautiful, combining scientific precision with artistic grace. The drawings of the skeleton show bones not as dead, static objects but as structures of perfect mechanical design, shaped by function, beautiful in their efficiency. The drawings of muscles show them in layers, revealing how they wrap around bones and interact with each other. The drawings of the heart. Leonardo was particularly fascinated by the heart. Show not just its chambers and valves but attempt to understand how blood flows through it, how the valves open and close, how the heart's pumping creates pressure that moves blood through the body. Some of his conclusions were remarkably prescient. He understood that blood circulates, though he didn't fully work out the details of the circulatory system as William Harvey would a century later. He understood that arteries and veins are fundamentally different types of vessels. He understood that the heart is a muscle that pumps blood, not, as earlier theorists believed, a kind of furnace that heats the blood. He correctly described the structure of many organs and the function of many body systems. Other conclusions were wrong, often because he was misled by the ancient authorities he was trying to go beyond. He believed, following Galen, that there were tiny invisible pores in the wall of the heart allowing blood to pass from one side to the other, when in fact blood must travel through the lungs. He believed that semen came from the spinal cord. He misunderstood the function of several organs. But what matters is not that he was sometimes wrong, every scientist is sometimes wrong, but that he was asking the right questions and using the right methods. Careful observation, detailed recording, testing of hypotheses against evidence. Leonardo planned to publish a comprehensive treatise on anatomy, combining his drawings with explanatory text. He envisioned a work that would revolutionize understanding of the human body, showing it not as a mysterious creation beyond human understanding but as a machine, complex but ultimately comprehensible, governed by mechanical principles that could be observed and analyzed. He discussed this planned treatise with friends, particularly with Marcantonio della Torre, a young professor of anatomy at the University of Pavia who became Leonardo's friend and collaborator around 1510. But the treatise was never published. Della Torre died of plague in 1511, ending a collaboration that might have produced something extraordinary. Leonardo's anatomical studies were interrupted by his move to Rome in 1513, where he was accused of unseemly conduct, possibly witchcraft or black magic, for his nocturnal dissections, and was forbidden to continue. Although he resumed some anatomical work later, the great project was never completed. At Leonardo's death in 1519, his anatomical drawings and notes, along with all his other notebooks, passed to his favorite pupil and companion, Francesco Melzi. Melzi recognized their value and tried to organize them, but the task was overwhelming. Leonardo had produced thousands of pages of notes and drawings, often written in mirror script, left-handed. He wrote from right to left, often mixing subjects on a single page, often leaving ideas half-developed. After Melzi's death in 1570, his son Orazio inherited the notebooks but had little interest in them. He sold some, gave others away, and many were lost or scattered. Leonardo's anatomical drawings, which would have revolutionized medicine if published in the 16th century, remained almost completely unknown for nearly 3 centuries. They were rediscovered in the late 19th century in the Royal Library at Windsor Castle, where they had ended up as part of the English Royal Collection, probably in the 17th century. When scholars finally examined them systematically, they were astounded. Here was anatomical knowledge that would not be rediscovered until the 19th century in some cases. Here were drawing techniques and illustrative methods that were centuries ahead of their time. Here was evidence of a mind that had grasped truths about the human body that the official medical profession of his age had missed completely. Today, Leonardo is recognized as one of the greatest anatomists who ever lived, and his anatomical drawings are studied by medical students and artists alike. They remain unsurpassed for their combination of accuracy and beauty, their synthesis of science and art. They stand as testament to what Leonardo believed throughout his life, that truth is visible to those who look carefully, that art and science are complementary ways of knowing, that the human body is not a mystery to be reverenced from afar but a machine to be understood through patient observation and rational analysis. In his anatomical work, Leonardo the artist and Leonardo the scientist merge completely, showing us a mind for whom the distinction between the two would have made no sense at all. The period from 1500 to 1516, the last 16 years of Leonardo's life, was marked by movement and change. Gone was the stability of his Milan years, the 17 years of steady patronage and productivity under the Sforzas. Instead, Leonardo moved from city to city, from patron to patron, seeking commissions, pursuing his scientific studies, designing military fortifications, serving as engineer and advisor to various rulers, always moving, always working, but never quite settling into the kind of sustained productivity that had characterized his Milan years. In 1500, returned to Florence after Milan's fall, Leonardo reconnected with the city of his youth, now 50 years old and famous. The Florentine Republic, newly re-established after the fall of Savonarola, was suspicious of Leonardo. He had, after all, spent 17 years serving their enemy, the Duke of Milan. But his fame was such that they could not ignore him. In 1502, Leonardo briefly entered the service of one of Renaissance Italy's most notorious figures, Cesare Borgia. Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI and the brother of the infamous Lucrezia Borgia. He was a military commander of considerable skill and absolutely no scruples, conquering city after city in central Italy in an attempt to carve out a state for himself. He needed engineers who could design fortifications, plan sieges, create maps of territories he conquered or hoped to conquer. Leonardo, needing employment and apparently unconcerned with the moral character of his employers, accepted the position of military architect and engineer in Borgia's service. For several months in 1502, Leonardo traveled with Borgia's armies through central Italy, inspecting fortifications, drawing maps, designing improvements to defenses. The maps Leonardo created during this period are remarkable works of art and engineering, showing cities and regions from a bird's-eye view with extraordinary accuracy. His map of Imola, a town Borgia had conquered, is a masterpiece of cartography, showing streets and buildings with such precision that it could be used today. Leonardo created it by pacing out distances, measuring angles, and then transferring the data to paper with mathematical precision. It was one of the first truly accurate maps of a European city. But Borgia was a dangerous man to serve. His cruelty was legendary. His political power was built on his father's position as pope, a position that would not last forever. Leonardo left Borgia's service in early 1503 and returned to Florence, where he rejoined the Painters' Guild and began seeking more stable employment. In Florence, Leonardo faced competition from a younger artist who was rapidly establishing himself as Leonardo's equal or perhaps even superior. Michelangelo Buonarroti, 23 years Leonardo's junior but already famous for his sculpture of David, which had been installed in 1504 in front of the Palazzo Vecchio, Florence's city hall. The two men apparently disliked each other, and there are records of public arguments between them, where Leonardo was curious about everything, moving from subject to subject with restless energy. Michelangelo focused intensely on a few themes: the human figure, especially the male nude, and the expression of spiritual power through physical form. Where Leonardo's work was characterized by subtlety and softness, Michelangelo's was characterized by power and dramatic tension. They represented two different approaches to art, two different temperaments, and each seems to have found the other's approach wrong-headed. In 1503, Florence commissioned both Leonardo and Michelangelo to paint large battle scenes on opposite walls of the great council chamber in the Palazzo Vecchio. Leonardo was to paint the Battle of Anghiari, showing a famous Florentine military victory from 1440. Michelangelo was to paint the Battle of Cassino. Both artists produced preparatory cartoons, full-size drawings on paper that would guide the actual painting. Both cartoons were displayed and became famous, with artists coming from across Italy to study them and make copies. But neither artist completed the actual wall painting. Leonardo began painting his Battle of Anghiari directly on the wall, apparently again using an experimental technique rather than traditional fresco. He completed a central section showing cavalry in violent combat, horses and men tangled in a struggle for a battle standard, faces contorted with fury and effort. Contemporary accounts describe it as extraordinary, perhaps the most dynamic and powerful battle scene ever painted. But the experimental technique failed. The paint didn't adhere properly and began to slide down the wall. Leonardo abandoned the project in 1506. The unfinished painting was later destroyed when the hall was remodeled. All that survives are copies made by other artists and Leonardo's preparatory sketches. While in Florence between 1500 and 1506, Leonardo worked on the Mona Lisa, as we discussed. He also began another painting, Leda and the Swan, showing the Greek myth of Leda seduced by Zeus in the form of a swan. The original is lost, but copies suggest it was another of Leonardo's explorations of complex poses and psychological states. He worked on studies for the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, a painting he had begun years earlier and would continue to refine until late in his life. And he conducted his anatomical studies, including the dissection of the centenarian we discussed earlier. But Florence did not hold Leonardo for long. In 1506, the French governor of Milan, Charles d'Amboise, acting on behalf of King Louis XII of France, who now ruled Milan, requested that Leonardo return to Milan to work on various projects. The Florentine government protested. They wanted Leonardo to finish the Battle of Anghiari, but eventually agreed to a temporary leave. Leonardo returned to Milan and never completed the Battle of Anghiari or lived in Florence again. Back in Milan under French rule, Leonardo worked on a variety of projects. He continued his anatomical studies, collaborating with Marcantonio della Torre until della Torre's death from plague in 1511. He studied hydraulics, the movement of water, designing canal systems and water-lifting devices. He continued his work on a treatise on painting, organizing notes and creating exemplary drawings to illustrate various principles. He worked on mechanical devices, gears, levers, pulleys, transmission systems. His notebooks from this period show a mind still intensely curious, still asking fundamental questions about how the natural world works. He also painted, though less prolifically than in his first Milan period. He worked on a now-lost painting of Leda and the Swan. He painted a now-lost portrait of a young woman whose identity is unknown. He worked on St. John the Baptist, one of his last completed paintings, showing the saint in a mysterious, almost disturbing pose, pointing upward toward heaven with one hand while the other hand lies across his chest, his face bearing an enigmatic smile that has reminded many viewers of the Mona Lisa. The painting is dark, mysterious, psychologically ambiguous, far from the clear religious imagery that most patrons wanted. In 1513, Leonardo moved to Rome, perhaps hoping for patronage from the newly elected Pope Leo X, a Medici who had known Leonardo's work in Florence. But Rome did not prove welcoming. The Pope's favorite artists were Michelangelo, who was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and Raphael, who was painting the Vatican apartments. Leonardo, now 61 years old, found himself marginalized. He was given living quarters and a small salary but no major commissions. He continued his scientific studies but was forbidden to continue human dissections after complaints about his unseemly conduct. His main project seems to have been designing a scheme to drain the Pontine marshes near Rome, an engineering project that was never executed. Rome must have been frustrating for Leonardo. Here he was in the artistic capital of Europe, working in the shadow of the Pope himself, and yet he had no important work. Michelangelo and Raphael were receiving the major commissions, covering vast walls and ceilings with paintings that would define high Renaissance art. Leonardo, their elder and in many ways their superior in technical skill, was essentially idle. Perhaps he was too old, perhaps his reputation for leaving works unfinished preceded him. Perhaps his interests had simply diverged too far from what patrons wanted. Whatever the reason, Rome was not a happy period for Leonardo. Then, in 1516, came the invitation that would shape the final years of his life. Francis I, the young king of France, invited Leonardo to come to France as first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. Francis, 22 years old when he became king in 1515, was one of the great art patrons of the age. He admired Leonardo's work intensely and wanted the great master at his court. He offered Leonardo a generous pension, 700 gold écus per year, a manor house near the royal chateau at Amboise in the Loire Valley, and freedom to work on whatever projects interested him. For Leonardo, old, tired of traveling, perhaps sensing that his time was short, this offer must have seemed like a gift. A peaceful place to work, financial security, a patron who admired him and made no unreasonable demands. He accepted. In late 1516, at age 64, Leonardo da Vinci left Italy forever. He traveled over the Alps to France, taking with him 3 paintings, the Mona Lisa, the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, and Saint John the Baptist, along with trunks full of notebooks and drawings. He brought his faithful companion Francesco Melzi and his servant Battista de Valanis. He would never see Italy again. The manor house of Cloth Loose sits in the heart of Amboise, a town in the Loire Valley about 200 kilometers southwest of Paris. Built in the late 1400s, it was a comfortable residence with thick walls, diamond-paned windows, and a tower housing a spiral staircase. King Francis had acquired it years earlier as a summer residence for members of the royal family. It was connected by an underground passageway to the much larger royal Château d'Amboise, which sat on a hill overlooking the town. When Francis offered the house to Leonardo, he was offering not just a place to live but proximity to the court, easy access to the king, a position of honor and respect. Leonardo arrived at Cloth Loose sometime in the spring of 1517, having made the arduous journey from Rome over the Alps during the winter of 1516-17. He was 64 years old, and the journey must have been difficult. We know from contemporary accounts that Leonardo was already experiencing physical problems. His right hand, his painting hand, was partially paralyzed, probably from a stroke. He could still draw and write with his left hand. He had always been ambidextrous, though right-handed for painting, but his days of creating large paintings were over. He could still think, plan, design, advise, but the physical creation of major artworks was beyond him. Yet despite his physical limitations, Leonardo's final years in France were productive in their way. King Francis was attentive and respectful, visiting Cloth Loose regularly to discuss art, science, philosophy, engineering. Francis was young and intellectually curious, and Leonardo was the greatest genius of his age. The conversations between them must have ranged over everything: painting techniques, the structure of the human body, the flight of birds, the design of fortifications, the nature of water, the arrangement of ideal cities, the principles of warfare, the relationship between art and mathematics. Leonardo designed for Francis, though few of his designs were executed. He drew plans for a grand palace at Romorantin that would serve as a new royal residence, with elaborate canal systems for defense and commerce. He designed court festivals, including a mechanical lion that could walk on its own and, when struck with a wand, would open its chest to reveal a cluster of lilies, the symbol of the French monarchy. He continued to work on his notebooks, organizing material for his various planned treatises on painting, water, anatomy, the flight of birds. He continued to draw, his left-handed drawings from this period showing undiminished skill even as his right hand failed him. And he worked on his paintings. The 3 paintings he had brought to France, the Mona Lisa, the Virgin and Child with Saint Anne and Saint John the Baptist, he continued to refine, adding tiny touches, adjusting tones, perfecting details. For Leonardo, a painting was never truly finished. There was always something more to be done, some subtle adjustment that would bring it closer to his vision. Art historians believe that all 3 paintings show evidence of work from Leonardo's French period, meaning that Leonardo was working on them until very near the end of his life. The manor of Cloth Loose itself was comfortable, if not grand. It had a large kitchen with a fireplace big enough to roast an entire ox, though Leonardo, being vegetarian, probably had little use for that particular feature. It had living quarters on the upper floors with views over the Loire Valley. It had workshops and storage rooms where Leonardo kept his paintings, notebooks, instruments, and the accumulated materials of a lifetime of work. The underground passage to the chateau was a source of fascination. A vaulted tunnel perhaps 600 feet long, allowing Leonardo to visit the king without having to go outside in bad weather, maintaining a kind of private connection between the old master and the young monarch. Francesco Melzi, who had been with Leonardo since Leonardo's second period in Milan, was more than just an assistant by this time. He was companion, secretary, nurse, and heir. He managed the household, dealt with tradesmen, copied Leonardo's notes, and cared for his aging master with devotion. Contemporary accounts describe Melzi as devoted to Leonardo, and Leonardo clearly reciprocated, treating Melzi as the son he never had. When Leonardo's right hand became paralyzed, it was Melzi who wrote letters at Leonardo's dictation. When Leonardo's health failed, it was Melzi who nursed him through illness. The servant Battista de Villanis, who had been with Leonardo for many years, also lived at Cloth Loose, and there was household staff, cooks, cleaners, perhaps a gardener to tend the grounds. The house was not isolated but part of a community, the town of Amboise, where Leonardo became a familiar figure, the old Italian master whom the king honored, walking sometimes in the town or along the Loire, still observing, still making notes, though his pace was slower and his energy diminished. We have glimpses of Leonardo's daily routine in France from scattered sources. He rose late, perhaps because his nights were often disturbed by illness or simply because he had always been more productive in afternoon and evening than in morning. He took meals with his household, simple meals in keeping with his vegetarian preferences. He worked in his studio, though less intensively than in his youth, looking at his paintings, making small adjustments, organizing notes. He received visitors, scholars, artists, courtiers curious to meet the famous Leonardo. He conversed with King Francis when the king visited, which seems to have been fairly regularly, the two men discussing ideas, Leonardo sharing his vast knowledge accumulated over a lifetime. The surrounding countryside reminded Leonardo in some ways of Italy, though the light was different, softer and more diffused than the sharp Italian light he had known. The Loire Valley with its chateaux and vineyards, its forests and fields, provided new subjects for observation even though his energy for systematic study was waning. He drew plants he saw in the gardens of Clause-Luce. He made sketches of the chateau and the town. He watched the weather, noting the movement of clouds, the patterns of rain, the quality of light at different times of day. But increasingly his thoughts turned inward, toward summary and completion rather than new exploration. He looked through his notebooks, tried to organize them, thought about the treatises he had always meant to write, on painting, on anatomy, on water, on the flight of birds. He knew he was running out of time. He must have known that most of his work would remain unfinished, that the systematic exposition of his knowledge would never be completed, that his investigations would remain scattered across thousands of pages of notes rather than organized into the comprehensive treatises he had envisioned. The relationship between Leonardo and King Francis has become the subject of legend. The most famous story, recorded by the biographer Giorgio Vasari and depicted in numerous paintings in later centuries, claims that Leonardo died in the arms of King Francis, who held the master's head as he breathed his last. This story, while touching, is almost certainly false. Court records show that Francis was elsewhere on the day Leonardo died, probably hunting or attending to administrative business. But even if the story is not literally true, it captures something real about the relationship. Francis honored Leonardo, visited him regularly, treated him with respect and affection, gave him freedom to work as he chose, and mourned his death genuinely. By the spring of 1519, Leonardo's health was clearly failing. He had been ill off and on throughout the winter. His paralyzed right hand made writing difficult, and he had to dictate letters and documents to Francesco Melzi. On April 23, 1519, knowing that death was near, Leonardo summoned a notary and dictated his will. It is a remarkable document, revealing and orderly, showing Leonardo even in extremity concerned with practical matters and with providing for those he loved. He left most of his property to Melzi, the paintings, the notebooks, the instruments, all the tangible remains of his life's work. He left his vineyard near Milan to his longtime servant Salai and to Battista de Villani's. He left money to his half-brothers in Florence. He requested that his funeral be simple but proper, with masses said for his soul at several churches, with candles and alms for the poor who would carry his body to the tomb. He wanted to be buried in the church of Saint Florentine in the cloisters of the royal chateau at Amboise, a prestigious burial site usually reserved for royalty and high nobles. Francis granted this request, honoring Leonardo even in death as he had honored him in life. On May 2, 1519, in his rooms at Clause-Luce, Leonardo da Vinci died. He was 67 years old. The cause of death was probably what we would now call a series of strokes, though contemporary accounts simply describe him as dying peacefully after a period of illness. Francesco Melzi, who was with him to the end, wrote a letter to Leonardo's brothers in Florence announcing the death. This loss is grievous to everyone, for it is impossible that nature will produce such a man again. May the Almighty God grant him eternal rest. Leonardo was buried on August 12, 1519, in the cloisters of the Collegiate Church of Saint Florentine at the Château d'Amboise, as he had requested. The funeral was attended by the church officials and members of the French court, though not by King Francis himself, who was traveling. 60 poor men carried tapers and received alms. Masses were said. Leonardo da Vinci, the illegitimate son of a Tuscan notary and a peasant woman, the self-taught genius who had revolutionized art and made fundamental contributions to science, was laid to rest in a royal chapel in France, far from the land of his birth. The story should end there, but there is a poignant coda. During the French Revolution in the 1700s, the Church of Saint Florentine was destroyed. Leonardo's grave was lost. In 1863, an excavation of the site uncovered skeletal remains with a bronze ring on one finger and stone fragments bearing parts of Leonardo's name. These remains were reburied in the chapel of St. Hubert, a small building on the grounds of the chateau. Whether they truly belong to Leonardo is uncertain, but a marker there today claims them as his. After Leonardo's death, Melzi packed up all the notebooks, drawings, and papers, thousands and thousands of pages representing a lifetime of observation and thought, and took them back to Italy. He spent years trying to organize them, to make sense of them, to extract from them the various treatises Leonardo had intended to write. But the task was overwhelming. Leonardo's notes were not organized systematically. They mixed drawings of machines with anatomical studies, mathematical calculations with observations about clouds, mechanical devices with philosophical speculations. They were often written in mirror script. They jumped from subject to subject. Making sense of them required someone who understood everything Leonardo had understood, and no such person existed. After Melzi's death in 1570, the notebooks scattered. His son Orazio had no interest in them and sold or gave away many pages. Over the centuries, they ended up in libraries, private collections, monasteries across Europe. Some were lost forever. Some were bound into volumes that mixed pages from different periods and subjects. Some sat unread and unrecognized for centuries. Gradually, over 400 years, scholars located the surviving notebooks, cataloged them, translated them, studied them. Today, we know of about 7,000 pages of Leonardo's notes and drawings that survive, though scholars estimate he produced 3 to 4 times that many originally. What we know of Leonardo comes largely from these notebooks. They reveal a mind that was curious about everything, that moved from subject to subject with restless energy, that saw connections others missed, that combined observation and imagination in ways that were centuries ahead of their time. They show us Leonardo the engineer designing machines that would not be built for centuries. Leonardo the anatomist discovering truths about the human body that would not be rediscovered until the 1800s. Leonardo the physicist and mathematician exploring principles that would later be formalized by Galileo and Newton. Leonardo the artist thinking about light, color, perspective, composition, the representation of motion and emotion. They also show us Leonardo's frustrations, his unfinished projects, his tendency to move from one interest to another before completing the first. They show us a man who wanted to understand everything but could complete little because understanding led to more questions, which led to new investigations, which led to still more questions in an endless chain. They show us someone who was simultaneously enormously productive, thousands of drawings, dozens of paintings, countless investigations and designs, and strangely unproductive, leaving most projects unfinished, most treatises unwritten, most designs unrealized. But perhaps this is exactly what we should expect from a mind as capacious as Leonardo's. Perhaps completion, closure, the finished product were less important to him than the process of investigation itself. Perhaps what mattered was the looking, the drawing, the thinking, the endless questioning that drove him from subject to subject, from city to city, from patron to patron, always searching, always observing, never quite satisfied that he had reached the bottom of any mystery because each answer revealed new depths, new questions, new wonders to explore. In the quiet rooms of Clauthlus, in the final year of his life, Leonardo continued to work until his physical strength failed him. He continued to look out the windows at the French countryside, so different from the Tuscan hills of his childhood, and see in it the same patterns, the same laws, the same evidence of the mathematical principles underlying all of nature. He continued to think about the paintings he would never finish, the treatises he would never complete, the machines he would never build. And then, on a spring morning in 1519, it was over. In the centuries since Leonardo da Vinci's death, his reputation has only grown. He has become not just a historical figure but a symbol, an icon representing human genius at its most universal. The very phrase Renaissance man, someone accomplished in multiple fields, someone whose interests and abilities transcend narrow specialization, is essentially a description of Leonardo. He represents what we might achieve if we refuse to accept the boundaries between disciplines, if we followed our curiosity wherever it led, if we trusted in observation and reason and imagination equally. During his lifetime, Leonardo was respected as a great artist, certainly one of the best painters in Italy. But his scientific work was almost completely unknown. His anatomical drawings sat in trunks. His engineering designs existed only in notebooks. His investigations of water, light, mechanics, botany, geology, all remained private. A few friends and patrons knew about them. His students knew he filled notebooks with strange drawings and mirror-written text. But the world at large knew Leonardo primarily as the painter of the Last Supper and a few other works. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scholars finally gained access to the scattered notebooks and began studying them systematically, that the full scope of Leonardo's genius became clear. Here was not just a painter but a scientist, and not just a scientist in one field but in many fields simultaneously. Here was someone who had anticipated discoveries that would not be made for centuries, who had designed machines that would not be built until the industrial age, who had combined observation and imagination in ways that modern science would only later recognize as the proper scientific method. The anatomical drawings revealed that Leonardo had understood the structure and function of the human body more completely than any of his contemporaries, that he had made discoveries about circulation, about muscle mechanics, about the structure of the heart and brain that would not be independently rediscovered until the 17th, 18th, even 19th centuries. If Leonardo had published his anatomical work, medical science would have advanced by more than a century. The engineering designs showed machines for everything from flying to underwater exploration to automated manufacturing. Many of them were impractical given the materials and power sources available in Leonardo's time. But the concepts were sound, the mechanical principles were correct. Leonardo had understood gears and levers, friction and inertia, the relationship between force and motion. He had thought about problems that would not be solved until the age of powered flight and submarine warfare. The studies of water revealed a mind thinking about fluid dynamics, turbulence, wave motion, erosion, problems that would not be fully addressed until the 20th century. The studies of light showed someone grappling with optics, with atmospheric perspective, with the nature of vision. The studies of proportion showed a mathematical mind exploring geometry, investigating the relationships between different shapes and solids. What emerges from the notebooks is a portrait of a mind that was simultaneously deeply grounded in observation. Leonardo believed in looking at nature, in drawing what he saw, in trusting his eyes, and wildly imaginative, capable of extrapolating from observation to possibility, of seeing in the way birds fly the principles that could be applied to human flight, of seeing in the way water flows the principles that govern all motion. Leonardo's legacy in art is equally profound. While he completed relatively few paintings, probably fewer than 20 that survive in whole or in part, those paintings changed the course of Western art. The Last Supper established psychological drama and realistic emotion as central concerns of religious painting. The Mona Lisa demonstrated what could be achieved through patient, obsessive attention to subtle gradations of tone and color. The Virgin and Child with Saint and showed how figures could be arranged in complex, interlocking compositions that suggested both physical and psychological connection. The various preparatory drawings and cartoons showed younger artists new ways to think about composition, gesture, expression. Leonardo's influence on other artists was immediate and profound. Raphael, who was in Florence when Leonardo was working on the Mona Lisa and the cartoon for Saint Anne, adopted Leonardo's pyramidal compositions and his attention to psychological expression. His Madonnas show clear Leonardo influence. Michelangelo, though he disliked Leonardo personally, learned from Leonardo's anatomical investigations and his attention to how bodies move in balance. Later artists, Titian, Tintoretto, Rubens, Rembrandt, down through the centuries to the moderns, all studied Leonardo's works and learned from them. Beyond his direct influence on other artists, Leonardo changed what people expected from art. Before Leonardo, painting was primarily a craft, valued but not considered intellectual. Leonardo argued and demonstrated that painting was a liberal art, as important and intellectually demanding as poetry or philosophy. He wrote that painters must be knowledgeable about mathematics, geometry, anatomy, optics, botany, geology, about everything, in fact, because painters must be able to depict everything. This elevated conception of the artist as intellectual, as someone whose work requires not just technical skill but profound knowledge and understanding, became central to how artists thought about themselves and how society thought about art. But Leonardo's ultimate legacy may be even broader than his specific contributions to art and science. He represents a way of engaging with the world that is increasingly rare in our age of specialization. He represents a refusal to accept that disciplines must be separate, that art and science have nothing to say to each other, that observation and imagination are opposed rather than complementary. He represents a model of human curiosity that is restless, ranging, omnivorous, willing to investigate anything, willing to consider any question, willing to follow ideas wherever they lead. In our modern world, where we are told we must specialize early, must choose between science and art, between the quantitative and the qualitative, between reason and imagination, Leonardo stands as a reminder that this is not the only way, that a single person with sufficient curiosity and effort can engage meaningfully with multiple domains, that looking carefully at how birds fly can inform both scientific understanding and artistic practice, that dissecting a human heart can teach you about pumping mechanisms and also about the relationship between structure and function that applies to everything, that mathematics and painting are not opposed but complementary ways of understanding the visual world. Leonardo's life also reminds us of the costs of such an approach. His wandering from interest to interest meant that he completed relatively few projects. His insistence on understanding everything before proceeding meant that many works remained unfinished. His reluctance to publish meant that much of what he learned died with him or remained unknown for centuries. In a practical sense, Leonardo's career could be seen as somewhat unsuccessful. A lot of promise, not enough delivery, too many abandoned projects and unrealized plans. But this judgment seems to miss something essential. Leonardo was not trying to have a successful career in the modern sense. He was trying to understand the world. Every investigation was valuable in itself, whether or not it led to a completed painting or a published treatise. Every drawing in his notebooks, every observation recorded, every question asked, all of these were valuable because they represented the human mind engaging with reality, trying to understand how things work, trying to see clearly. And in the end, Leonardo's apparent failures, the unfinished paintings, the unpublished treatises, the scattered notebooks, have become part of his legacy. They show us the process of thinking, not just the finished product. They show us a mind at work, trying, experimenting, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, always curious, always striving. And that process, that striving, that endless quest for understanding, may be more valuable than any number of completed projects. When we look at Leonardo's life, we see someone who was in many ways deeply unhappy, never fully accepted, always struggling to find patronage, leaving most projects unfinished, dying far from his homeland. But we also see someone who was profoundly alive to the wonders of the world, who looked at everything, mountains and muscles, birds and buildings, water and weaponry, with fresh eyes and endless curiosity. Who drew not just to create art but to understand, to see more clearly, to grasp the principles underlying appearances. And we see someone who, despite all the limitations of his time and circumstances, illegitimacy, lack of formal education, dependence on patrons, technological limitations that prevented many of his designs from being realized, managed to push human knowledge and human creativity to new heights. Who showed that a single mind, properly applied, could range across art and science, could make fundamental discoveries in anatomy and engineering, could create paintings that would be treasured for centuries, could design machines that would not be built for hundreds of years. Leonardo da Vinci's life tells us that human potential is vaster than we usually imagine, that the boundaries we accept between different kinds of knowledge are often arbitrary, that curiosity combined with close observation and disciplined thought can carry us further than we might think possible. His life tells us that it's worth pursuing understanding even when that pursuit leads to incomplete projects and unpublished works, because the pursuit itself has value, the observations themselves contribute to human knowledge, the act of looking and thinking and drawing and questioning is itself a contribution. In the Tuscan countryside where Leonardo was born, the landscape looks much as it did 5 centuries ago. The same hills rise and fall. The same type of birds wheel overhead. The same rivers carve through the same limestone. But because Leonardo walked those hills, observed those birds, studied those rivers, and recorded what he saw, we see them differently. Because Leonardo dissected human bodies and drew what he found, we understand our own bodies better. Because Leonardo painted the Last Supper and the Mona Lisa, we see possibilities in painting that would not otherwise exist. Because Leonardo filled thousands of pages with drawings and notes investigating everything from the growth of plants to the movement of water to the flight of birds, human knowledge is richer. And so we remember him, this illegitimate child from a small Tuscan town, this man who left so many projects unfinished, this universal genius who died far from home. We remember him because he showed us what a human mind can accomplish when it refuses to be limited, when it insists on looking at the world with clear eyes, when it combines observation and imagination in pursuit of understanding. We remember him because his life exemplifies what we might call the boundless potential of human creativity, the idea that we are not limited to a single domain, that art and science can inform each other, that curiosity and discipline together can carry us to heights we can barely imagine. Leonardo da Vinci lived 67 years, from 1452 to 1519. He created perhaps 20 paintings, thousands of drawings, tens of thousands of pages of notes. He investigated anatomy, botany, geology, physics, engineering, mathematics, optics, hydraulics, mechanics, and much more. He never married, never had children in the conventional sense, though he had students and friends who loved him. He died in a foreign country far from the Tuscan hills where he was born. His body rests in a chapel in France, though we cannot be certain even of that. His paintings hang in museums where millions view them every year. His notebooks sit in libraries and are studied by scholars still finding new insights in his observations. His legacy lives in every anatomical textbook, every engineering class, every art student learning about perspective or composition or the modeling of form. But more than any specific contribution, Leonardo's legacy lives in the idea he represents, that human beings are capable of understanding the world, that observation and reason can penetrate nature's mysteries, that art and science are not opposed but complementary, that curiosity is not idle but essential, that we need not accept the boundaries others impose on what we can learn or create or become. That, in the end, is what Leonardo teaches us, and that is why, 5 centuries after his death, we still speak his name with reverence and wonder. If you've made it to the end of this journey through Leonardo da Vinci's extraordinary life, I hope you found it as fascinating as I have. His story reminds us that genius is not just about innate talent, but about relentless curiosity, careful observation, and the courage to question everything. If this story moved you, if Leonardo's quest for knowledge resonates with your own desire to understand the world more deeply, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These deep dives into history's most remarkable lives take countless hours of research and writing, and your support helps us continue bringing you these stories. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the same boundless curiosity that drove Leonardo to see the world as no one had seen it before.